And so we had this crash course in German class, and our professor, Professor Williams, or Dr. Williams, was hilarious. And he gave us Martin Luther. We were learning the German high script, and he gave us Martin Luther's A Mighty Fortress to translate.
Okay.
And we were all sort of budding scholars, and we got out all of our resources, and we went and we translated Martin Luther's A Mighty Fortress from German into English. And then we came in the next day, and Dr. Williams came in with his guitar.
Mm-hmm.
And he sat at the front of the room, and he's like, okay, great. Who wants to sing theirs? And we all looked down at our translations, and we're thinking, we're not embarrassed. It's just a bunch of nerdy dudes. But we're looking down at our translations and thinking, you can't sing that.
Yeah, there's no melody that's going to fit this.
And so Dr. Williams, he looked at us and he was like, so let me get this straight. It started out as a hymn. You translated it, and now it's unsingable.
Wow.
I don't think you translated. I think you broke it is what you did.
Welcome to the Reality Is podcast, where we talk about real life and real faith. Today, I'm joined by Ed Gravely, who is our life group pastor here at the church, at Crossroads Community Church. But more than that, I actually consider him a dear friend of mine. So I'm super excited to be here with you today. And we're going to be talking about Bible translations. This is a great topic for us to discuss, and who better to discuss it with than you? And I say that, but I want you to start off by just kind of telling us why. Like, why do you have the credentials to actually be the person to talk about what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. Yeah. So as Joey said, my name is Ed Gravely, and I am one of the group's pastors here. There are two of us.
Yeah.
Pastor Pete is our other group's pastor. I like to think of myself as his assistant, though he will deny that.
Yeah, I think everybody's going to deny that.
Yeah. So been at the church since, I guess, 2016? Joey and I came to the church at about the same time.
Yeah.
I came here, though not to be a pastor at Crossroads. I came here to be a professor at Charleston Southern University. I was a professor at Southeastern Seminary before that. I'm the New Testament specialist at Charleston Southern, and I have a PhD in paleography and textual criticism. And so the ancient manuscripts of the New Testament are my specialty. And I teach Greek at Charleston Southern and taught it at Southeastern as well. And so obviously the translation is kind of the thing that we do. And so thinking about how to translate the Bible and the sort of the products of that in the modern age is kind of the thing that we talk about quite a bit.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
Wonderful. I love that. So you do a special thing here on Sunday nights. I remember this was probably about 5 years ago. You came to us as elders, and said, hey, I would like to disciple our church. I want them to be discipled. And I have time on Sunday nights. I'd like to start this thing called Sunday Night Discipleship. And you've been doing that faithfully now for our church. But the last one you did, it was more of a big thing. Like, we told all the life groups, we told everybody, hey, this is a special event. We're going to be doing a Sunday Night Discipleship. And Ed is going to be talking about the New Testament and how we got the New Testament. And would you just kind of share with me how that was laid on your heart and why that was something you wanted to do for our church?
Yeah, sure. So Sunday Night Discipleship has undergone several evolutions, if you will. When we first started it, and as I'm sure you remember, our church was going through a difficult time.
Absolutely.
And it was a nice way the elders, and we had brownies and coffee and all kinds of stuff, which we should bring back, by the way. Pastor
Thank
Pete,
you.
are you listening? And And so, yeah, we had a fairly large group. And then, of course, almost immediately after we got momentum there, the pandemic hit.
Of course.
And then we started having to record Sunday Night Discipleship and launching it on Tuesday. In fact, I think we called it Sunday Night.
Sunday Night Discipleship on Thursdays.
Yeah, that's right.
So-
That's right. And so anyway, so what Sunday Night Discipleship is now is that on the first Sunday of every month, either Pastor Pete or I teach through the material that Pastor Richard is going to be covering in the sermon for our life group leaders. So if I look at the schedule and I say, okay, between now and next month, Pastor Richard's going to preach basically 2 Corinthians 3, 4, and 5, then I'll do in the space of an hour, I'll just talk with our leaders through the material that's coming up.
Yeah.
And then every other Sunday night, whichever one of us is not, and that is a rookie mistake right there, brother. Have your phone on.
Turned it off. I'm sorry.
And so if Richard is preaching in the New Testament, then I teach those chapters, and then every other Sunday, Pastor Pete will then preach something. He's going through the book of Genesis right now.
Yeah.
But what we did is in our mentorship, we have a mentorship where we meet with our life group leaders and sort of walk them through how to be a leader and how to teach and Christian theology. And we kept getting a lot of questions about how did we get our Bible? How old is the New Testament?
Yep.
How were Paul's letters collected? And we covered some of those things in mentorship, but I thought it would be a good idea if we could find a way to get that material out to the whole church.
Yes.
And then what happened is, this is sort of the nuts and bolts of ministry. One of the Sunday nights where Pastor Pete was supposed to be teaching, he got pulled in to do a wedding. And so he was like, I need you to teach for me. And I thought, well, I should probably then, I didn't want to teach from Genesis because he was covering that. And so I said, well, maybe I'll just do this thing that we want to do. And then several of the life group leaders said, well, we want to come. We want to bring our whole life group. And then I started thinking we're not going to fit in the fellowship hall.
No.
And so that's when we moved into the sanctuary. And I think we stopped, the last we counted, it was about 120, but I think we probably had closer to 150 or somewhere in there. So yeah.
So excited.
Yeah, and we talked about, I tried to make 3 arguments in that. I tried to argue that there's good evidence that the New Testament was collected together. It was written very early, certainly relative to what other people might argue.
Yes, indeed.
I tried to give evidence that that Paul's letters were collected together very early, probably by him. And then I also tried to argue that the New Testament was collected together as a book relatively early, certainly compared to what you might hear on like the Discovery Channel, or the History Channel, or YouTube, or something like that. So
Okay.
that's where all that. That's a long way to say that, but that's where all that came
No,
from.
that's where it generated from. And now, the real reason we're here is Bible translations.
Correct.
Because you got some questions about that. It was like, how did these translations even come about, and all these type of things. And so we want to talk about the modern translations. There's
Right.
so many of them out there. And you and I were joking earlier about one
Yes.
that I was trying to read through.
Right. Yes.
The Pidgin
Right.
translation.
And there's a Klingon translation, and there's
I'm going, wait, there's a what translation?
right.
Like, seriously, you weren't even playing with me when you said, no, there's a Klingon translation.
There is, yeah.
So what's the deal with all these translations that we have with the Bible?
Right. So there is a obviously from the very beginning, one of the very first things that Christians did was translate the New Testament. Because as they very quickly began to obey the teaching of Jesus that we're to take the gospel to the nations. And
Absolutely.
so when you take the gospel to Egypt and people there don't read Greek, you need to translate the New Testament into Coptic, for example. And so they're in my field, they call those versions, the early versions. That's translation. And we still use that word. That's what we're talking about, the King James Version and the English Standard Version. That's a scholarly word for translation. And so from the very beginning, the Christians have been about the task of translating the Scripture. And even before that, the Jewish communities that lived in North Africa several hundred years before Jesus did the same thing. They translated the Old Testament into Greek, which is the Old Testament that most of the New Testament authors had as their Bible, was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Septuagint is what it's called. And so, and then without going into a bunch of detail, starting around the turn of the millennia, around 1000 and moving forward, you start to see, and what is in the what we would call the Old English period, which is Anglo-Saxon, and you start to see English translations in small chunks, small pieces begin to appear. And then, of course, you have some of the famous complete Bibles, Tyndale's Bible and Wycliffe's Bible. And then, of course, that sort of culminates in sort of the quintessential English Bible, which is the King James Bible. And, of course, now we live in a world where if you go to a secular bookstore, a Books A Million or a Barnes & Noble, like 10% of the store is made up of just shelves and shelves and shelves of Bibles.
Absolutely.
And there are a bunch of translations. And the reality is, we were joking about Klingon and Pidgin and some other things, but the reality is most of the English translations we have and that we've had for the last 100 years are actually, they're all really good. They're not all the same. They have different philosophies, but they're actually really good. We have an amazing embarrassment of riches, I guess we could say, in the terms of English translations that we have.
Okay, yeah. And there are so stinking many of them. They're like, I don't even know how many. Like, I tried to look them up because I was like, okay, I'm going to sit here. I'm going to meet with you. I want to talk about how many translations there are, all these type of things. And I'm going, there's just too many.
Yeah, no,
There's
I
too
don't
many
know
of
the
them.
number, but if you told me there were 100 English translations currently in print, I wouldn't be surprised.
So why? Why so many of them? Because you just said it's English.
Right.
These are English translations. Why do we need so many English translations?
Right. So there's a couple of answers to that. One of them is very cynical, and I'll lead with the cynical one.
Of course you will.
And that is, there's a lot of money to be made in selling Bibles. And now that the smaller Bible publishers many of them have been bought up by larger secular publishers, that actually infused a lot of money into Bible publishing. And so, the short version is that there are a lot of translations because there's just a lot of money to be made in a translation, right?
Wow.
Now, because there's a huge appetite for English Bibles.
Yes.
Now, having said that, the other piece of it is that because we live in the modern technology, the modern age of technology, old translations don't always go away, and so you can get 4, 5, 6, 7 different versions of the King James if you want. You can get 3, 4, 5 different versions of the NIV if you want. Because every time they will revise an one of the English translations will get a revision and update, you can still buy the old one, or you can find it on the internet.
Yes,
And so that's also part of it. But the other part of it is that, well, some of it, again, this is going to sound a little cynical, but I don't mean this as cynical. Some of it's just practical. Some of it is financial, but it's practical. So, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention, Lifeway, used to use the NIV in all of their literature. And I don't know the exact figures, but they were paying millions of dollars in royalties to Zondervan for the use of the rights to the NIV. And then there was a guy named Farstead, and he wanted to put together a translation, a New English translation, but he died as it was beginning to get started, and the Lifeway decided to fund it. There's a whole story there, but the short version is Lifeway essentially produced their own English translation, which was the Holman Christian Standard
CSB.
Bible. The 8 was the CSB now. It was the HCSB then. And you say, well, you could ask the question, why spend all that money and produce another English translation? And the answer is because we never have to pay another dime in royalties ever again because we own it.
Okay, I get that.
And so those are the kinds of stories that you'll hear for every single one of the translations for why another English translation. And the answer is, well, because it's cheaper than continuing to pay someone else for theirs.
And so then how? Because each one's different.
Correct.
Each one is very different. And you said earlier, they're good. These are good translations. How different are they? And how do we know how accurate that translation is? Are you comparing that to the original? Like, okay, this was the original translation. Now we translated it to look like this. And now we're going to do a revised version of this. And now in that revision, we're going to change it to this. And now we're going to do a whole different English translation of this. At some point, doesn't it lose something?
Right. So there's a couple of questions in there. Let me deal with the apologetic one first. Do not. So I talk to my students a lot about this. It's first thing the first semester when they do New Testament survey. And they definitely have this idea. In fact, used to do this when my classes were smaller. I used to do this little experiment where we would get out our laptops and we would open up to Google Translate. And I'd have them type a sentence into Google Translate and have them translate it from English into Spanish, and then from Spanish into French, and then from French into English, back into English. Now, Google Translate is much better than it was a decade ago. But what you used to get was some kind of weirdly formed gobbledygook for the most part. And students wonder if that's actually not what has happened, because they'll say things to me like, well, hasn't the Bible been translated from, in fact, I had an editor at a major publisher say this to me, hasn't the Bible been translated like from Greek into Latin, and then from Latin into German, and then from German into English? And the answer is that's actually not what's happened. And so as we move later and later into the modern era, we have more and more access to ancient manuscripts of the New Testament. And so, and every time a New English translation comes out, they're not strictly based on previous translations, like there's like the telephone game. This one is based on this one, is based on this one, but they're all pointing back to the same set of ancient Greek manuscripts. And so in that sense, I would argue that the translations are actually probably getting more accurate and better. Simply because technology makes those things available. I'm a huge fan of the King James, and maybe we can talk about that.
Absolutely.
I don't recommend it for my students because my students are going to struggle with the New Testament, and I want that struggle to be over learning what it says, not trying to figure out how to read 17th century English prose, right? So there's a language problem with the King James now that we're 400 years away from it. But when the King James, guys like Erasmus, who put together the Greek text that underlies the King James, I mean, he had 7 or 8 Greek manuscripts at his disposal, and he didn't have the internet, and he couldn't hop on a plane and fly somewhere. Whereas now with technology, scholars have 5,000 manuscripts at their disposal to try to figure out what did the text originally say. So the differences in the manuscripts, all of these modern English translations, the differences are based on a translation philosophy, not on what does the underlying Greek text say, if that makes sense. I don't know if I made that clear. Does that make sense?
To me, but it probably confused a whole lot of
Right.
people.
So, yeah, in other words, everybody's looking at the same ancient manuscript so we have these ancient manuscripts of Galatians,
Yes.
right? They all basically say the same thing. There's some minor variations of spellings and stuff. Let the scholars figure that out.
Mhm.
But everybody's working from the same Greek text. The NIV and the New American Standard are working from the same Greek text.
Got it.
But their translations are very different not because they're looking at a different Greek text to translate, but because they have different concerns in trying to render those words into English.
Mm.
So, and this is not as easy as it sounds. We often will use phrases like, well, this translation is not as accurate as that translation. And that's a very understand that it feels like when you say that, you've dipped your toe in the water, but you actually dove into the deep end without realizing it. So, for example, how do you render a figure of speech? Right. So for example,
don't.
right. If I said if I use the expression, "You're pulling my leg,"
Yeah.
which means in a kind of a humorous and friendly way, you're trying
Yeah.
to get one over
Yeah.
on me.
Yeah.
And now I ask you to translate that into Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
You got a couple of options, particularly if you're writing it in a book. Option number one, translate it literally.
Yes.
You're pulling my leg,
Pulling my leg.
which means nothing to anyone that does not speak English.
Mm-hmm.
And then you put a footnote and say, this is an idiom that means, right?
Got it.
That's option number one. Option number two is to actually use an idiom that exists in Spanish that means the same thing. So like, for example, in Honduras, they say, you're pulling my hair. That's their version of you're pulling my leg, right? And so it's a Central American, it's a euphemism.
Got it.
And so you can do that. But at that point, understand you're not translating anymore. You've actually replaced one idiom, one figure of speech with another one. The third thing you can do is to dismiss the idiom completely and just describe what the person is saying. You are trying to get one over on me. And at that point, it's not a figure of speech anymore. It's straight prose.
Yeah.
And so when you then ask the question, well, which one of those is better? That's not an easy question to answer.
Because neither one's better.
They're all right.
Because that's exactly.
They're all
right.
right. And different translation teams feel differently about which of those things they should do most of the time.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
And also, and that's one piece. And then the other piece is that the English language just changes. And I want to be careful here, our tolerance for politeness changes. So from the time of the King James translators had a number of rules they operated by. And one of the unwritten, it's kind of unwritten, but it's sort of stated, is they were going to produce an English translation that could be read in church.
Okay.
And that means there are a handful of things that you probably need to clean up, right? Or you have to rely on the reader to deal delicately with the issue.
Yeah. Because we read in the Bible and you go, ooh, am I allowed to say that in church? Like, how many times have you come to me before service and said, Joey, we're going to be going over a really tough section in Scripture right now.
Yeah.
So please make an announcement. If there are any kids out there, we have a special place where they can go.
Right.
Because this is about to get...
Exactly. And so, for example, when Paul in Galatians is talking about the false teachers who have been arguing that being obedient to the Jewish law codes is how you attain salvation, and they've made circumcision the singular issue.
Yep.
And Paul says that these false teachers need to be cut off from among you, but he uses a word for cut off that is designed to make all the middle school boys giggle because it sounds like the word for circumcision. And so you won't know that if you read any English translation, because what they've done is they've made it a bit more polite.
It's tolerable to our ears.
Correct. Maybe this, I don't know, I'm not going to make this a PG-13 podcast, but in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, when he's talking about, he says, this is the will of God for you, that you abstain from sexual immorality. The ESV, for example, there says that each one of him possesses his own body, his own vessel. But the Greek word there is a word that could be understood as a phallic symbol. Let's just put it that way.
Okay.
And so, in other words, it does mean that you control your own body, but he has particular body parts in mind that modern readers might not be comfortable reading from the pulpit. And so, but my point is that our toleration for that is we're increasingly more tolerant of that kind of thing. Modern readers are like, hey, if Paul is making a circumcision joke, let's hear it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
If he really does mean that part of the male anatomy, then let's just say that. Whereas 100 years ago, that would have not been tolerated.
Yeah, you
right?
weren't
And
touching
so those are the kind, and also words just change meaning. Right?
I've noticed that just in my own lifetime.
Sure.
You know, and especially you have children that are same age as mine.
Yep.
And so it was just talking to our kids the other day about the new words that they're using, and I'm thinking about the words that I used to use and what they meant when I used them.
Right.
Which mean absolutely nothing of what it means nowadays to use that word. Like for us to say, "Whoo, that's bad," that meant it was good.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So yeah, we're constantly changing how we talk.
Sure, and even where, and of course the one that I always use with my students because it's easy and it illustrates and it makes everybody laugh is, I'll just ask them, what does the word gay mean?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're in the 1700s, it means colorful.
Yeah.
If you're in the 1800s, it means happy. And of course, if you're in 2023, it means homosexual, right? And so obviously, as word meanings, you can't, as I tell to my students, that word is like the rainbow.
Yeah.
Right. It's just that ship has sailed. You're never getting that one back.
Yeah.
Right. And so we just have to change our translations and pick different words now.
Still working on that rainbow, man.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get the rainbow back.
Right. But because language does change,
Yeah.
and even our opinions change. So I'll give you another one that comes up a lot. In Greek, there's a thing in Greek that is called the default masculine. Right. And so now you and I are about the same age.
Yeah.
And so we lived through all of the current revisions to how you use pronouns.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
so when I was in elementary school, if you didn't know the gender of the person you were talking about, you used he. Right. And then we went through that he/she phase.
Yep.
And now, but my modern students, they will use they.
Yeah.
They will use a neuter plural pronoun to describe a singular person. If any of my students need help, all they have to do is come to me.
Yeah.
Where that's actually grammatically incorrect because any is singular and they is plural, right? And so anyway, so Greek that's called.
Thank you for that quick lesson.
that's called the default masculine, and Greek does that. When a Greek speaker in Paul's day did not know the gender of the person they were talking about, they defaulted to a masculine pronoun. When they were talking to a group of people that had men and women in it, they also defaulted to a masculine pronoun. They would never use a neuter pronoun to describe a person. That would be like calling them a thing, right? So, for example, the most common word that Paul uses to describe other Christians is it's the phrase adelphoi mu, my brothers. Literally, my brothers. But it's masculine because it is a masculine pronoun, plural. But he means men and women. He clearly means men and women because in Philippians 4, he says, and now my brothers, and then immediately starts talking to two women in the church. And so the question is, how do you translate my brothers? Yeah. Right? And so the ESV leaves it as my brothers, and then the first time it occurs on every page, they put a note that says, or brothers and sisters. The NIV actually renders it as brothers and sisters. And so both of those are correct. Paul literally says my brothers, but to just say that and say nothing else is actually to miscommunicate what Paul says.
Exactly.
Because he does say my brothers, but that's not what he means. He means my brothers and sisters. And so those are the kinds of things, but again, our willingness and our toleration and our interest in like gender equity in our speech, it changes from generation to generation.
Yes,
and even very sort of conservative evangelical Baptists would say, well, if he means men and women, let's say men and women. We don't want to leave the ladies out. Yeah. Whereas in the 80s, there was no appetite for that sort of thing. Like he said, brothers, leave it as brothers, who cares? Ladies know he's talking about them too.
Yeah.
And modern ladies say, I'm not sure they do know he's talking about them too. You know what I mean? And so those are the kinds of sensibilities change. That's what produces the kind of appetite for new English translations.
Got it. So as you talk about all these different translations, and what I'm hearing is there's just too much difficulty in trying to translate it. Can you just kind of touch on why? Why is it so different? And what are the challenges to actually translating a Bible?
Yeah, so if you think of it like if you had a continuum, right, like a line.
Yeah. On
one end, you've got, and I'll use the big words. You've got what's called formal equivalence, and that means the translation philosophy is as much as we possibly can. Let's try to be as word for word as we can. And on the other end of this continuum is basically what we would think of at the extreme end. We would think of as like a children's Bible,
Okay.
right? We're going to tell the story of David and Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, you don't have a translation at all. So most people don't make that at the extreme end.
Yeah.
Usually what they'll put at the extreme end is what we would call a paraphrase, right? So if this is word for word, it never really is just word for word. But if this is an attempt at word for word, this is an attempt at big idea for big idea, thought for thought.
Okay.
And everywhere in between, scholars have to try to make decisions. And it's not just as simple as we're going to do this everywhere we can, because there are plenty of places where when you are I'm going to be as literal as possible, you actually have to abandon other principles that you think are very important.
Yeah.
I remember when I was a young PhD student, I had to pass a German reading proficiency exam, and so we had this exactly, and so we had this crash course in German class, and our professor, Professor Williams or Dr. Williams, was hilarious, and he gave us Martin Luther. We were learning the German high script, and he gave us Martin Luther's A Mighty Fortress to translate.
Okay.
And we were all sort of budding scholars, and we got out all of our resources, and we went and we translated Martin Luther's A Mighty Fortress from German into English. And then we came in the next day, and Dr. Williams came in with his guitar.
Mm-hmm.
And he sat at the front of the room, and he's like, okay, great. Who wants to sing theirs? And we all looked down at our translations, and we're thinking, we're not embarrassed. It's just a bunch of nerdy dudes. But we're looking down at our translations and thinking, you can't sing that.
Yeah, there's no melody that's going to fit this.
And so Dr. Williams, he looked at us and he was like, so let me get this straight. It started out as a hymn. You translated it, and now it's unsingable.
Wow.
I don't think you translated. I think you broke it is what you did. And so for example, the first half dozen words or so in the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews 1:1, they're alliterated. They all begin with the same sound. And that's intentional. He's creating a kind of word poem there at the beginning, and it's a P sound, it's a pa, 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 pa. And pastors will sometimes, alliterate to make things memorable.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you're going to translate that, you've got two choices. You can either try to find a decent English translation that is also alliterated, which no one chooses that option. Or you can just pick the best English words to translate those Greek words. And then the fact that it was at some point alliterated is completely lost to the reader. Yeah. Or you put it in a footnote. And so that's why I say it's never as simple as saying, well, why wouldn't anybody just pick the word for word translation? And the answer is because the Bible is filled with figures of speech, literary forms, things that are designed to rhyme and sound alike, and some of those can't easily be rendered into English, or if you do render them into English, you have to make sacrifices other places, usually with word specificity and those kind of things, or you've got to make decisions about idiom, as we talked about.
Yeah.
And those are some of the big challenges. And what most of your translations do is they compromise. They say, okay, we're gonna consistently handle X like Y, but in other cases, we're willing to make other decisions, right? And so on that continuum, you could map the modern translations, right?
Yeah.
So like the King James, the New American Standard, they're going to be the ones that'll be most on the formal equivalent end. And that means that almost all of the literary form is lost, right? On the other end, you've got the NIV.
Yep.
NIV is not a paraphrase. Well, actually, if you want to go paraphrase all the way to the end, then you've got like the Old Living Bible was a paraphrase. The New Living Bible is actually a translation, but it's definitely down here on this end, what's called dynamic equivalent. And most of the others try to make their decisions and fit somewhere in the middle, right? They're like, okay, these are the things we're going to render literally as we can. But when we come across figure of speech, when we come across some sort of poetic device, we're going to do our best to actually maybe make the words rhyme, or at least let them have meter. We're willing to make some sacrifice, because here's the thing: those alliterated words, the fact that those words are alliterated, that literary form is just as much God's word as the words that were actually chosen. Yeah. Right. In other words, if you believe in the inspiration, right, and inerrancy of Scripture, then the fact that these words are supposed to rhyme, God actually was the one who decided that they were going to rhyme. And so to just say, well, we'll just forget that part and we'll just do it. That's
You're taken away.
But you're translating, and so sacrifices have to be made.
Yeah. And this is a very weak illustration, of course, but I remember I had a song that I had done, and I needed to translate that song into Spanish.
Right.
So I had a guy who I knew, he speaks Spanish. I said, here's the song, here's the lyrics. I need you to translate them into Spanish for me. And in Spanish, it did not fit at all with the melody that I was trying to do. And so now I brought in this other guy who was a musician that spoke Spanish, and he says, "Oh, no, 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 you don't have to, like, these are extra words. You don't need these extra words to get the meaning across of what you're trying to say. All I need is just a moment." So it was like, "Lo que necesito es un momento." No, 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 no. You don't need all that. All you need is "Lo que necesito es un momento." And that still flows with the melody of what I'm
Right.
trying to do.
Yeah.
And I know that's a weak illustration, but it's a lot like what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah.
It may seem like something is missing. I don't have all the words there, but the meaning of what I was trying to get done is still portrayed, and it fits within the melodic structure of what I was trying to do.
Right, and so we want to remember in all of this that the English translations that we have even with I'm pointing out all of the challenges to translations,
yes.
but the English translations that we have are still actually very good.
Yeah.
They are amazingly good. And as a guy who spends his time looking at ancient translations of the New Testament, our modern translations are incredibly good.
Wonderful.
And
that's a good to know. Like knowing
Right,
that
very-
you've studied it, this is your expertise, and you can turn around and say, "Look, the English translations that we have are very good translations. You shouldn't have to fear any of them that you're reading as long as you're reading." And so here's an additional question I would ask for you, because there's a lot of English translations out there.
yes, there are.
Do you have some that you would say, okay, as long as you stick with these translations, you're good? Like I love New King James. You keep talking about the King James, but I like the NKJV,
Right.
Especially if I'm like trying to study and trying to dig into it and get it. But I like, if I'm just reading the Bible and I'm reading it kind of as a story from left to right, I like the New Living Translation.
Mhm.
I like the NLT. It reads really
Right,
nice to
yeah.
me. But for a season, even here at our church, we were doing ESV, and that was a new translation I had never even heard of before.
Yeah, 2000 maybe I think was when that's Holman. It's like 2008. I mean, it's relatively recent.
It's
less than 20 years old.
But I went through and I'm going, wow, this is a really good translation. I like this. And then the other one you were talking about, CSB, which used to be HCSB.
Right.
So those are the 4 English ones that I know of that I read through and I like. Are there any that you say, hey, man, stay away from? And I used to do NIV too. I used to do the NIV a lot. Are there any that you would just off the top of your head say, man, this is an English translation you may want to stay away from?
No.
That's good to know.
I would say this though, it's probably going to be a good idea for you to know what it is that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you're thinking to yourself, man, I need to get me a Bible and I want to study and I'm going to do a bunch of word studies on Paul and I'm going to do this or that, then the New Living is probably going to not be helpful.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, which again, so here's a question.
Mhm.
How much theology do you want to involve in translation? So when Paul has 2 words at his disposal to describe the human form.
Yeah.
One of them is the word sarx, which is generally translated as the word flesh. And one of them is the word soma, which is translated as body.
Mhm.
Well, when some of the writers of the New Testament use those words interchangeably.
Mhm.
Paul does not. When Paul is talking about our actual physical form, he uses soma, body. When he wants to talk about our sin nature, the struggle that we have of living in a mortal body, our corruption, he uses the word sarx.
Hmm.
In fact, most theologians understand that when Paul uses the word flesh, he actually means our sinful nature.
Mm.
Right? And so the NIV, when they come across sarx in some of Paul's letters, they actually translate sarx as sin nature.
Got it.
But understand what they're doing there is it's a theological interpretation. It's one I happen to agree with,
Mhm.
but it's also a translation philosophy. I'm not sure it's not my favorite way to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it
so that's another one of those questions where Paul uses this word, but we know what he means. Should we leave the word? Because sometimes Paul uses words in a challenging way, right? Sometimes Paul will use the word law in one sentence in 4 different ways to twist, kind of get you all spun up because he's about to hit you with the truth.
Ah.
And so, how easy do we make it for the reader? And as you move down that continuum towards like the New Living Translation, they're making it easier for you.
Okay.
There's always interpretation involved in translation,
Yes, indeed.
but some of them are more interpretively forward than others. And so knowing what you have, but here's the good news. Every single one of the modern Bibles has a publisher page usually at the beginning of every Bible, where you can read their translation philosophy.
Mm.
So I'll give you another funny one. The the New American Standard Bible,
Yes.
when you look at their translation documents, 1971 I think was the first edition. They actually have as one of their translation philosophies. It goes something like this: in places where the Greek or Hebrew text was difficult or ambiguous, we tried to render an equally difficult or ambiguous English translation.
Oh God. Oh, come
And it's like,
on.
in other words, we tried to make as few decisions as possible
Yeah.
and rescue you, the reader,
Yeah.
and leave you with the problem that we had. We
Yeah.
passed our problem on to you. And there's something nice about that, but the problem is that that's a challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's
And of course, one
huge.
of the other things that you run into is just and it's a big deal now in publishing, is reading grade level.
Mm.
And so we just published a book with a major secular publisher, and one of the first things they did was take our text and run it through a kind of AI type software
Yeah.
that said,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
reading level is this on? And
Mhm.
when it was too high, they were like, we need to simplify this a little bit.
Wow.
So they're shooting for about a 6th grade reading level.
Oh, my
And so,
goodness.
but that's what all modern publishing is shooting towards. And so,
Mm.
but when you try to read the New American Standard, for example, it's difficult.
Mhm.
It's the sentence phrasing is different because they've tried to reorder, because Greek and Hebrew words come in very different orders than English words.
Yeah.
They've tried to do very little reorganizing of clauses, and you feel like you're stumbling over yourself because it's English, but it is not standard English.
Yeah.
It's
It's
Greek.
more confusing to read.
Correct. And so, but they're doing that so that they can even, as best they can, even preserve some of the structure in the English translation. And there are people who love that.
Mhm.
But if you decided, man, I just want to sit down today and read through the Gospel of Matthew,
Yeah.
then I'd get an NIV.
Yeah.
I would get a New Living,
Yeah.
and something that's going to just give you the story.
Absolutely.
And so again, know what you have.
Mhm.
Um,
And why you're reading it. Is
right.
What you
and,
said.
Right. And we live in America, and so you can grab an app on your tablet or phone and literally have all of them.
Yes, you can.
And so
Yes, you can.
there's no reason to have to pick one.
Mhm.
I actually use, those of you who heard me teach on Sunday Night Discipleship and other places, I use the ESV. This is going to sound really silly. I did some publishing for them, for Crossway, and they started sending me free Bibles. And so I just started using them because I always had a free Bible.
Yeah.
And then they were one of the first people to come out with a free app,
Mhm.
and I just started using it. And now I just kind of know how the ESV goes.
Yeah.
And so I stick with it. Pastor Pete loves the CSB.
Mhm.
So here's one more thing. One of the other things that modern translations have, as their translation philosophy, though they would never tell you this, is they have, if there's a traditionally popular way that a text reads, don't mess with it,
Mm.
right? So, for example, this is going to get real technical for just a second. John 3:16.
Yeah.
There's a word in Greek that the King James translates as so. For God so loved the world.
Mhm.
Well, in the 17th century, the word so was an adverb that meant thusly, in this way.
Okay.
But that's not what so means to modern English speakers.
Yeah.
To modern English speakers, we read that as God loved the world so much,
Mhm. Exactly.
right? It's a different kind of adverb.
Yeah.
Well, the word is thusly. And so the CSB translators, the HCSB translators, toyed with the idea of rewriting John 3:16. So instead of it says, for God so loved the world, it actually said, this is the way in which God loved the world, which is what the Greek text actually says.
Yes.
But they decided, you can't mess with John
Boy,
3:16.
don't mess with John 3:16.
We
I
don't. We
care.
cannot be the translation that changed John 3:16
No.
because we will be the main character on Twitter for the next
Of-
month,
of
right, on
course.
Christian Twitter.
Of course.
And so, and you'll see a lot of that. And my students will ask me, why did they translate it this way? And the answer is probably because that's just the way we've always done it.
Yeah.
But if you want modern scholarship and avant-garde, the CSB will do that sometimes. So, for
Okay.
example, the CSB is the very first translation that I know of to stop using the word leprosy.
Hmm.
So the Greek word is the word lepros, and but the word leprosy in 2023 means something very specific. It's a tropical, very contagious, or it's not a very contagious tropical disease. Hansen's disease is what it is.
Yeah.
And nobody in the New Testament had Hansen's disease. Nobody actually had leprosy. It was lepros. They had a usually very contagious terribly deforming skin conditions, which is not leprosy.
That's not, yeah.
And so, and everybody knows that. Scholars have known that for a century probably, but translations just leave it as leprosy because the King James did, and it is the Greek word lepros. But that word was a broad term described to all sorts of contagious skin conditions. It got pinned to a particular kind of infection, leprosy, Hansen's disease. But the ESV or the CSB it was HCSB then was the first one to say, let's just translate it as something else. But there's no elegant way to do that. And so they end up calling it a contagious skin condition.
Wow.
And so, which is not elegant. It's not an elegant solution.
No.
But they're trying to, again, they're trying to undo some of the legacy things that have happened over as English translations have evolved. I actually wrote some of the study notes for the Worldview Study Bible, and actually wrote a little article about the change that was made there with the help of one of our biology professors, who's a virologist, and so that was fun. But anyway, so those are also the kinds of things that come up as scholarship changes, as we understand new things. Modern translations will sometimes go back and revisit those things, and you got to be, publishers are wary of that sort of thing because it can be very bad for business, but it's
absolutely.
And then again, here's sort of the final problem. Here's the question: how much of these issues do we leave to the pastor and the teacher, and how much of them do we include in the translation? Right? So the pastor who is teaching can say, this is actually not what we call leprosy. This is such and such, right? But modern translations are more and more interested in being standalone, readable Bibles apart from the ministry of teaching, and therefore, which is why they're packed with study notes and introductions and all of those kind of things. Because there's complications there, but in both directions. But that's also another one of those things that's happening in modern translation. So I use the ESV. I like the CSB. I've published in a CSB Bible, the Holman Worldview Study Bible, David Dockery's Worldview Study Bible. Dr. Link likes the CSB. I do like to read the NIV. I used to like the New King James a lot because it has a lot of really great, if you're interested in textual criticism, it has a lot of really great notes. And it will tell you like how the Textus Receptus reads and how the Nestle text reads and how the UBS text reads, which are these various eclectic Greek texts where scholars are trying to figure out what the original said.
And that's why I like to study from that.
It's impossible to find that in any other English Bible.
But it gets through all that. So you've mentioned so many. And so quickly, do you have a favorite? Do you have a favorite translation?
Yeah, so if you're asking me as a historian and as a professor, you got to pick the King James. I don't actually read from the King James. But the King James, we should probably at some point do a podcast on the King James.
Because I'm sure you could do 45 minutes just on that.
The King James it's nothing short of miraculous in how it captured the English-speaking Christian world's imagination, and it is wildly influential even on our language, right? I'll use a figure of speech in class, and my students they'll laugh. That sounds old-timey, and I'm like, well, that comes from the King James, and they have this impression that this was a thing ancient old English speakers said, and that's why the King James used this phrase. But it's actually no, we use that now because it was a quirk of translation in the King James. And there's actually been books written on all of the figures of speech that the King James translation created in English.
Wow.
But there was huge political turmoil in England, Christian England, and King James wanted to produce an English translation, and he had one goal, and that was he wanted to produce an English translation that the Separatists, the Puritans, and the Anglicans would all use.
Wow.
And he succeeded.
Yeah.
He succeeded, and it was the best-selling book in the world until maybe 20 years ago. It was the best-selling Bible in the world until maybe 30 years ago. It was the best-selling book in the English language until maybe 40 years ago. And so it's just unbelievable. And even to this day, we just had a conversation about how modern translations can't even update the language because if it reads like the doesn't read like the King James does, people are going to call them heretics.
So something's wrong with you. Why would you do that? Yeah.
So there's nothing quite as impressive as the King James. But the ESV is the one that I use. And again, I'm so utilitarian that I just use it because it's just the one that I use. That's great. Yeah, I don't really have a favorite in that regard. Okay. So my wife, though, reads through the Bible every year, of course, and as a discipline has done that since she was like 16 years old. And she tries to pick a different translation every single time. to
That's
make sure
awesome.
that she's not falling into a rut, not missing things that she's overly
That's
familiar with.
awesome.
Just the slight differences in translation make your brain perk up and
Mhm.
make you pay attention and
Mhm.
say, "Ooh, that's not how I thought that went. Why
Yeah.
does that go that way?" And those are all you're getting the various translation. Again, it's a massive luxury to have
Mhm.
all of these
It,
translations,
it
and so
really is.
we ought to
It
make as
really
much
is.
of those things as we
And we
possibly
should just
can.
be thankful that we actually have it, and
Yep.
we can pick whichever version we want that makes us feel good
Yep.
when we read it.
And be
So,
good stewards
Yes.
by
yes.
by using them all.
Absolutely.
100%.
Man, I love that. I love the time that we spent together. And I thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. And I thank you guys for being a part of this podcast. I mean, we could go on so much longer, I know, but we'll just have to bring you on again and,
Okay.
and talk
Happy to do it.
through a lot of stuff. So thank you guys for joining us on the Reality Is podcast, where we talk
Thank
about
you,
real
guys.
life, real faith. And we look forward to having you guys join us next week, where we're going to be talking about Thanksgiving, because that's what's going to be coming up soon, Thanksgiving. So we'd love to have a conversation about that. And remember to like us, download. If you are following us, follow us and let us know that you're there, and let us know what you'd like to hear about, because we'd love to kind of bring up some topics that you guys want to hear about too. But for now, thanks for joining us. God bless you, and you guys have a great day.